This is the continued story of the book I Saw God's Hand by E.L. Martin, as retold to the children of the Watertown SDA Church Primary Sabbath School. I'm your storyteller, Austin Bacchus. Let's go.
Chapter 13, Turama Cannibals Keep Their Word, and I've given it another title as well, called Angels Prepare the Way. Haru Hariva was one of the most unforgettable characters I've ever met. As one of our earliest converts in western Papua, he gave his young life to the Master and to his service. After a few years in our mission schools, he entered our old Marigata training school near Port Moresby, and he linked his life with a young woman named Kaura Moku. She was one of the most talented, consecrated Christian women I have known. Haru gave his whole life to mission service. He proved to be an outstanding teacher in many of our schools, but his burden was for evangelism. During the 15 years I was associated with this champion of the cross, I found him to be without parallel in opening up new work. As a linguist, Haru had no rival. I was amazed to learn Haru spoke no less than 32 languages and dialects. I've never been in a village, coastal or inland, when I had Haru with me, where I wasn't able to use him as my interpreter. He could always find someone who knew one of the many languages that he spoke. For years, the Turama River region had been a special challenge to mission enterprise. Other mission bodies on a few occasions had explored the possibility of beginning work among the cannibals of the upper Turama River, but they had turned away. I knew the gospel must go to these savage people, and the responsibility seemed to rest squarely on my shoulders, for it was part of my large territory. To find time for such a trip to the Turama River seemed impossible. At last I managed to schedule in 9 days, the very minimum required. As the time approached, my wife and I gave much time to prayer for the venture. We anticipated the announcement of such a trip to the students would cause some real concern. One morning, within 3 weeks of my planned departure time, I broke the news to the students at the close of our morning worship. It was as though we had dropped a bomb in the chapel. In tears, some of them pleaded with me not to go. They felt it would be goodbye forever. When they became fully convinced that I was going, they decided to have prayer meeting every morning and every evening. First, they prayed the Master would bring me and my passengers safely back, and second, they prayed the Lord would send his angels to prepare the way. Every person on the mission attended those early morning and evening prayer meetings. As we neared the time of sailing, my wife became apprehensive. She wasn't a good sailor, but she decided that she and the 2 younger children would come with me on the trip, for she felt that if I were to be killed, maybe it would be better for all of us to be lost together. We sailed one Sunday morning with several teachers, including Haru, plus the crew. By Monday afternoon, we had reached a point from which it was necessary to put out to sea for 2 or 3 hours to cross a bay before entering the mouth of the Turama River. To do this meant taking the sea beam on, but this was impossible because the waves had not abated, so all we could do was wait for a break in the seas. Tuesday proved to be just as rough. Wednesday morning was even worse. On Thursday morning, the seas were still quite rough, but my precious time was running out. So I decided to try it. We took a battering for a couple hours, but it was a real relief to those unaccustomed to sailing when we entered the mouth of the Turama River. The Turama River is 25 miles wide at the mouth, but it is cone-shaped and it soon narrows down considerably. It is known as the worst river on the Papuan coast for boars. Now, a river boar is not the type of boar that is related to the pig family. It is a tidal wave with a high, abrupt front. The Turama River continually carries a tremendous volume of water that increases at the peak new and full moon tides. This flow forces back the incoming tides until they build a wall of water that eventually drives up the river, going as far as 90 or 100 miles upriver. So the water of the Turama may run downstream for 9 hours, then the tides will push it backwards or upstream for the next 3 hours. Big tides cause big bores. King-size tides cause king-size bores, which can mean a wall of water 12 feet high, followed a few yards behind by another slightly smaller. A number of boats have been lost in the Turama's lower water because of these bore waves. All day we traveled up and up river until near sunset we were opposite a large village on the riverbank. About a quarter of a mile out from the village, we decided to drop anchor for the night. Because I had a new diesel engine in the boat and it was due for an oil change, I suggested that Pastor Koivi and 2 of the teachers could go over to the village with a picture roll. Perhaps they could conduct a meeting and tell the people the simple story of the Christ who died for them. They agreed to go, for they had no idea how to help me service the boat engine. They'd only been gone about half an hour when my wife told me they were on their way back. As soon as I saw Koivi's face, I knew something was wrong. "Master, we are wasting our time here. They are not the least bit interested." He told me he'd never seen the depths of heathenism as he had seen in the village that night. I am sure that if I had seen what he saw, I would have reacted much the same way. He and I agreed the gospel certainly must go to these people, and it would go in God's way in time. Next morning at dawn we set out again, pushing up and against the fast-flowing water. Toward midday, we saw several canoe loads of nearly naked people coming downstream. They were waving energetically at us. Apparently, they were trying to get us to stop. Even though my wife wanted me to stop, I decided we would keep going. As the canoes came closer, my wife said, "Please stop, see what these people want." I'm not stopping. As the canoes passed close by, my wife said, "I do wish you had stopped. Those people were crying." Again, I answered, "I'm not stopping. Those people have never seen this boat before. They don't even know us." I was eager to reach a headwater village that had been described by a government officer. Every few miles we passed villages until near sunset we dropped anchor at the village I had hoped to reach. For the opening Sabbath meeting, we went ashore and gathered together a few people and told them as simply as possible the grand old story of Jesus. Even though they were few in number, only about 15, they sat spellbound as they listened to the "big fella master on top. Master belong all." That's how they described God. At the close of the meeting, they assured us that by morning they'd have many more people waiting to hear us. During the night, they went out in the bush to where many were living in temporary houses while planting new gardens, and they sent word to a village we had passed quite a distance back on the river. By 6 o'clock the next morning, we were thrilled to see 50 adults eagerly waiting for us. I spoke for about an hour and a half. Then we told them they could go eat breakfast, and when they heard the siren on the boat, they could come back for another meeting. The leader of the group said, "You go eat your meal, but we will be here waiting for you. We have never heard these stories before." In all, that day, I spoke for more than 7 hours. We preached meeting after meeting, and the people did not want to leave. Unfortunately, I knew that early the next morning we had to be on our way back, for my tightly packed schedule would not permit any more time. We had lost so much time with the weather hold-up. I felt that with one reasonable day's run, we would reach the river mouth by sunset that day, which was Sunday. I well remember, down in the cabin that night, I poured out my heart to the Master, telling him I couldn't understand why we were permitted just such a short time with these people, with all the waste of precious time caused by waiting for the rough seas and all the cost of fuel, to really only have about 8 or 9 hours of preaching total on this 9-day trip. During the hours of the night, as I prayed about this matter, a bright thought came to me. The next morning, taking Haru aside, I asked him how would he feel if I were to leave him, 2 other teachers, and 2 of the crew behind, 5 in all, if I could buy a canoe for them to use as they went back down the Great Waterway. Haru said he would be very happy. He would count it as a great challenge and the toughest assignment I had ever given him, and the others readily agreed to join Haru. So going to the village early the next morning, I asked, could I buy a canoe? The village people asked what size. I replied, about a 5-man canoe. They said, "You will not get one this side of the river's mouth. We have only 1 or 2-man canoes in this river." I felt the risk would be too great with separate canoes, so I decided I'd have to abandon the idea, unless maybe the next village had a large canoe. As I started my engine, a man in a canoe pulled up alongside the boat and said, "I have a canoe I'll sell you." "What size?" "5-man." Impatiently I said, "Well, why didn't you tell me that while I was in the village?" He said, "Master, it's not in the village. It's upriver above the village." Well, needless to say, I was concerned about the time we were losing now. As we had already come downstream about 1 hour. It would mean 2 hours at least to go back against a strong current, but maybe this was God's answer. I decided to go back. Hurriedly, we took this man and his little canoe on board, and we traveled upstream, past the village where we had spent Sabbath. We continued on and on. Every mile I grew more impatient. Every little while I'd ask where the canoe was, and all I would get in reply was, "Master, he close up now." About an hour above number 1 village, I said, "Listen, this is too silly for words. Do you have a canoe or not?" He assured me he had. He said, "Now, Master, now he close up too much." Shortly he asked us to pull over against the bank, and he led us about 300 yards through the heavy tropical undergrowth. I was afraid my patience was exhausted. I couldn't see any reason why he'd have a canoe so far back from the river. "I'm going to have to go back and forget about the canoe," I said. "No, Master, it's him, he stop." Just then he showed me the canoe. Do you know what it was? It was a tree that had recently been chopped down, but not even the top of the tree had been cut off yet. In making dugout canoes, the men cut a log off to the desired length and they hollowed it out with the inside of an axe. Disgustedly, I walked back to the boat. The man pleaded with me to stay and pleaded with me to let him have an axe and a knife. Then he could make the 5-man canoe. He promised he could have the canoe finished in a week, a job that usually involved months of work. He said, "I will call all my people. We'll make big fires. We can work day and night till we get it finished." I asked Haru what he thought. He replied, "Fair enough. You can leave me and the 4 you promised behind. We will wait until they finish the canoe." I was almost fearful to leave Haru and company behind along with the axe and knife to pay the man, because after all, the people were still cannibals. All they had to do after we were gone was just kill the 5 men and the axe and knife would be theirs. But I knew under the impact of the Holy Spirit's power, our preaching had made a tremendous impression on these villagers. So we took Haru and the other men, together with the village man, back to the village. I left sufficient food for several days with the boys, as well as a new file so that Haru could sharpen all their axes so they could work faster. I gave Haru and his team explicit instructions. They were not to bypass any village as they worked their way down. They were to preach the gospel in every village. Whether they spent a day or a week in each was up to them, but I emphasized you must not bypass one village. We sailed away not knowing whether we would ever see them again. This long delay had held us up until after midday. By nightfall, we were back opposite the same village where we had anchored the first night on the up trip, instead of being at the river's mouth as I had planned. This was the same village where Pastor Koivi had claimed he had never seen such depths of heathenism in his life. We decided we had no alternative but to anchor, for there were too many floating logs to travel by night. Almost as soon as we dropped the anchor, I asked Koivi and some of the boat crew to go over to the village and tell the people to gather together. I would come over and speak to them. As they left, I expected that what I had asked them to do would take about 20 or 30 minutes, but at the end of an hour, there was no sign of Pastor Koivi and the other workers. After an hour and a half, I became anxious. Finally, after about 2 hours, I could hear the splash of the oars as the young men rowed back to the boat. Koivi's face was beaming. I asked what had happened. Koivi said, "I am not going to tell you. I brought some of the people over to tell you." Just then I saw a dirty old man, covered with pig grease, climbing over the side of the boat. I could see by his dignified bearing that he was a chief. Koivi said, "You just wait till you hear this man's story." Some 3 weeks before, this man was awakened by a bright shining light in his village. The next morning he called his people together and told them he was sure some great light was going to come to them. Then he said a week or so later he saw the same light in the night again, but this time it seemed to light up the whole river and shine most brightly on his village. So again he called his people together and told them soon some great light would come to them. Just a few nights before we arrived, he had seen the light again, but this time it seemed to be shining on the river's mouth. And as he had looked closely in his dream, he saw a pure white boat, and on that boat was a white man, a white woman, and 2 white children. As he continued to watch, the great light lit the way for the boat to travel up the river till it came to his village. He finished his story by saying, "That is why we tried to get you to stop as you were going up the river. That's why we cried in our canoes, for we thought the great light was going to pass us by." We talked on into the night of the Master's love and of the day when he would come back again, and how the light of his coming would be brighter than the noonday sun. Surely this was nothing short of a miracle, a direct answer to the prayers of the boys and girls back at our mission station, for it was over 3 weeks ago that they had first begun their early morning and evening prayer meetings where they had asked for angels to prepare the way. Furthermore, it was all part of God's plan that we were delayed in getting the 5-man canoe. Otherwise, we would have reached the river's mouth at the end of that day instead of stopping outside the village where we heard these wonderful stories of God's leading and of the sending of his angels to prepare the way.
Be sure to tune in next time for more stories from the book I Saw God's Hand by E.L. Martin. And meanwhile, feel free to check out these videos as well as others on my YouTube channel with many more mission and Bible stories for kids and adults. God bless you.